The heavy rain of Boston's autumn drummed against the garage roof, a rhythmic lullaby for a sleeping house. Oliver Hartwell stood in the dim flickering light, wiping decades of dust from his hands. It was supposed to be a simple mundane task, clearing space for his daughter's new bicycles. But behind the heavy oak workbench, hidden in a narrow forgotten cavity, sat a locked mahogany box. He forced the flimsy brass latch open with a flathead screwdriver, expecting old college memorabilia or discarded tax documents. Instead, the unmistakable faint scent of Vivian's signature gardenia perfume drifted into the damp air. Inside lay stacks of thick, cream-colored envelopes. Oliver recognized his wife's elegant, sweeping handwriting instantly. But the letters weren't addressed to him. They were dated yesterday, last month, last year. The name on the envelope belonged to his closest business partner. His pulse roared, deafening the sound of the rain. Upstairs, his beautiful wife slept peacefully in their warm marital bed, completely unaware that in the cold darkness of the garage, her perfect lie had just bled to death. If the quiet, absolute devastation of betrayal and the cold, calculated art of revenge speak to your soul, stay with me. This is a story of how a heart turns to ice. The rain in Boston rarely whispered. It arrived with an aristocratic arrogance, hammering against the slate roofs of Oakwood estates as if demanding to be let in. It was past midnight. The temperature inside the sprawling three-car garage had dropped to a damp chill, but Oliver Hartwell didn't feel the cold. He stood perfectly still beneath the harsh glare of a single fluorescent bulb, his hands coated in a fine layer of gray dust. It was supposed to be a mundane Tuesday night chore. Their daughter, little Maya, was turning 7 this weekend, and Oliver needed to clear a space behind the heavy oak workbench to hide her new bicycle. He had moved a stack of forgotten paint cans and an old tarp when he noticed a loose piece of drywall near the floorboards, concealing a narrow rectangular cavity in the foundation. Inside the cavity rested a locked mahogany box. Oliver stared at it for a long time before pulling it out. The wood was smooth, expensive, and completely devoid of dust, unlike everything else in the garage. It didn't belong to him. He was a man of logic, a senior partner at Sinclair Ventures who dealt in risk assessments and market predictability. There was no logical reason for a pristine, locked box to be hidden behind a workbench. He found a flathead screwdriver on the pegboard. Pushing the metal tip under the flimsy brass clasp, he applied pressure. The lock snapped with a sharp metallic crack that echoed too loudly in the cavernous space. Oliver flipped the lid open. He had braced himself for financial secrets. Perhaps old tax documents from the DuPont estate, Vivian's family, or hidden debts she was too proud to mention. Instead, the faint, unmistakable ghost of Gardenia Vivian's signature perfume drifted up from the confines of the wood. Inside lay thick stacks of heavy cream-colored stationery. The envelopes were unbound, raw, and terrifyingly numerous. Oliver picked up the top envelope. His thumb brushed over the elegant, sweeping, cursive ink. It was Vivian's handwriting. He had seen that script on hundreds of anniversary cards on grocery lists on the back of photographs. But the name penned across the center of this envelope was not his. Blake Storm, his co-investor, his closest colleague, the man who had stood beside him at his wedding 8 years ago, raising a glass of champagne to toast to Oliver's eternal happiness. Oliver's breath hitched a sharp physical pain, blooming in the center of his chest. He pulled the letter from the unsealed flap. The paper felt heavy, expensive. August 14th, the date read, last month, while Oliver was in London securing the tech merger. My love, the letter began. The house is so quiet when he is gone, but it only makes the echo of you louder. I sat by the window in the study tonight wearing the silk robe you left at the hotel, imagining your hands. Oliver stopped reading. The words blurred, losing their shape, turning into venomous little hooks that tore at his retinas. He dropped the paper as if it were burning his skin. His hands, usually so steady when authorizing multi-million-dollar transfers, were trembling violently. He reached blindly into the box, pulling out another letter from the middle of the stack. Dated 3 years ago, another from the bottom, dated 6 years ago. 6 years. They had been married for 8. The garage seemed to shrink the walls, pressing inwards, suffocating him. The rhythmic drumming of the rain suddenly sounded like a ticking clock mocking him. He looked up at the ceiling. Directly above him was the master bedroom. Vivian was up there right now, sleeping soundly beneath their down comforter, her breathing soft and even. The perfect aristocratic wife, the loving mother, A sudden violent urge gripped him, an urge to grab the box, march up the oak staircase, throw the letters across the bed, and scream until his throat bled. He wanted to shatter the porcelain mask of his life and watch the pieces cut her. But Oliver Hartwell was not a man who screamed. He was a venture capitalist. He understood that when you discover a massive vulnerability in a system, you do not panic. You study it, you leverage it, and then you dismantle the system entirely. Slowly, methodically, his trembling stopped. He neatly folded the letters back into their envelopes. He arranged them exactly as he had found them. He closed the mahogany lid, pressing the broken latch together so it appeared untouched, and slid the box back into the dark cavity behind the drywall. He wiped his hands on a rag, turned off the fluorescent light, and walked out of the garage. The man who walked back into the house was not the same man who had left it an hour ago. Oliver Hartwell was dead. What remained was a ghost cold and hollow, fueled by a single terrifying purpose. My revenge was ready. The morning sun broke through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Oakwood Estate kitchen, casting long, elegant shadows across the Calicotta marble island. It was a picture of domestic perfection, the kind routinely featured in architectural magazines. Oliver sat at the head of the custom mahogany table, a cup of black coffee cooling between his hands. He had not slept a single minute. Every time he had closed his eyes, the elegant, sweeping loops of Vivian's handwriting had burned against the back of his eyelids like branded iron. Now she stood by the polished espresso machine, humming a soft, nameless tune. She wore a pristine white silk robe. The silk robe you left at the hotel, imagining your hands. The memory of the ink clawed at his throat, threatening to choke him. He forced himself to take a slow, measured breath, letting the bitter taste of the coffee ground him to reality. "You are up early," Vivian said, turning around with 2 porcelain mugs. Her smile was effortless, a practiced curve of perfectly painted lips. She looked beautiful, entirely untouched by the rot festering beneath the floorboards of their marriage. "Couldn't sleep," Oliver replied. His voice was steady, a low, even baritone that betrayed nothing of the wreckage inside his chest. "Thinking about the Sinclair portfolio." Vivian walked over her bare feet, patting softly against the heated hardwood. She placed a mug in front of him and rested a slender hand on his shoulder. The faint scent of gardenia washed over him. Last night it had been the scent of a ghost in a damp garage. Today it was the scent of a predator in his kitchen. Every muscle in his body rigidified at her touch. His instincts screamed at him to pull away, to shatter the mug against the pristine white wall, to demand answers. But he remained perfectly still, a statue carved from ice. "You work too hard, Oliver," she murmured, her thumb lightly tracing the collar of his dress shirt. "Blake was saying just the other day that you need to delegate more. Let him handle the upcoming tech merger." The casual mention of Blake's name was a masterclass in deception. There was no hesitation in her voice, no subtle shift in her gaze, no spike in her pulse. She delivered the name with the smooth, practiced ease of a woman who had spent 6 years compartmentalizing her life into airtight, soundproof vaults. Oliver looked up, meeting her gaze. Her eyes were a clear, striking hazel, radiating an artificial warmth that he now recognized as a brilliant, lifelong performance. How many mornings had they stood exactly like this? How many times had she kissed his cheek before driving to a boutique hotel room booked under a false corporate account? "Blake is highly capable," Oliver said, his tone perfectly neutral. "In fact, I plan on giving him a lot more responsibility very soon. I think it is time he truly earns his position." Vivian smiled, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "He will appreciate that. You have always been so good to him." "He is family," Oliver replied. The word tasted like ash on his tongue. She turned back to the counter to slice an apple for Maya's lunchbox. Oliver watched the silver blade of the paring knife slide cleanly through the fruit. The domesticity of the act felt violently absurd. He realized then that he was not just observing his wife, he was observing a stranger who had infiltrated his life, studied his habits, and used his unwavering trust as a shield. His phone vibrated on the marble surface. A text message illuminated the screen. It was from Blake Storm Morning O. "Catching the 9 a.m. train in. Let's review the margins before the board meeting." Oliver stared at the glowing letters. The trap was beginning to take shape in his mind, cold, complex, and flawlessly precise. He did not just want a divorce. He did not want a quiet, dignified settlement. He wanted to dismantle the very foundation of their arrogance. He wanted to watch them bleed out financially and socially, trapped in a cage forged from their own deceit. Is everything all right? Vivian asked, noticing his fixed stare at the screen. Perfect, Oliver said, locking the phone and slipping it into his tailored suit pocket. He stood up, adjusting his tie with practiced precision. Just another day at the office. The conference room at Sinclair Ventures sat on the 42nd floor, a glass and steel cage suspended above the gray sprawl of downtown Boston. Inside, the air was climate-controlled and smelled faintly of expensive leather and polished mahogany. At the head of the long table stood Blake Storm. Blake was in his element. He wore a bespoke navy suit that draped perfectly across his athletic frame, projecting the effortless charisma that had made him the firm's most effective closer. He was currently dissecting the quarterly projections of a Silicon Valley tech acquisition, his laser pointer dancing across the projection screen. Oliver sat near the window, his expression impassive, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. To the 6 junior analysts in the room, Oliver was the picture of focused seniority absorbing the data. In reality, Oliver was not looking at the spreadsheets. He was looking at Blake's hands. The same hands that had gripped the edge of the conference table were the hands that Vivian had imagined in her silk robe. The phantom scent of gardenia threatened to choke him again, but Oliver swallowed it down, burying the visceral disgust beneath a glacier of pure calculating logic. It had not always been this way. 10 years ago, long before the DuPont marriage or the Oakwood estate, it was just the two of them in a cramped, windowless office in Cambridge. They had eaten cold takeout noodles while drafting their first major prospectus. Blake had been the silver-tongued visionary who could sell ice to a blizzard, and Oliver had been the architect, the man who built the intricate, flawless financial models that made Blake's promises a reality. They had built Sinclair Ventures together. Oliver had trusted Blake with his life, his fortune, and eventually his home. 6 years, the voice in Oliver's head whispered. 6 years of smiling over expensive scotch while he slept with your wife. And if we look at the EBITDA margins, Blake continued, flashing his trademark confident smile at the board. We are looking at a 20% growth in the third quarter. It's a guaranteed win. Oliver, wouldn't you agree? The room shifted its collective gaze to Oliver. The silence stretched for 2 heartbeats. I do, Oliver said, his voice a smooth, resonant hum that betrayed absolutely nothing. In fact, the projections are so robust that I believe we should double our leverage position. But I want to keep the primary equity within the inner circle. Blake paused, lowering the laser pointer. You mean a private buy-in that, Exactly, Oliver replied, leaning forward just enough to project intimacy. He looked directly into Blake's eyes. A mezzanine fund, high yield, high risk, but strictly for senior partners. We use our personal collateral to underwrite the aggressive expansion. If the merger hits the projected targets, the personal payout will be astronomical. I'm moving $3 million of my own liquid assets into the margin account this afternoon. It was a beautifully constructed lie. There was no guaranteed win. The tech acquisition was highly volatile, a house of cards Oliver had secretly identified weeks ago, but had kept off the official risk reports. By suggesting they use personal collateral, he was inviting Blake to tie his own neck to the guillotine. Blake's eyes lit up with the unmistakable glint of greed. He trusted Oliver's financial clairvoyance implicitly. He always had. I like the sound of that, Blake said, unbuttoning his suit jacket. Count me in for 2. I'll authorize the transfer from my private trust. I'll have Tom draw up the paperwork, Oliver said softly, mentioning their lead attorney. As the meeting adjourned and the analysts filed out, Blake walked over, clapping a heavy hand on Oliver's shoulder. Brilliant play, O. As always, Vivian and I are lucky to have you looking out for us. The words were meant to be a casual slip of camaraderie, a blending of personal and professional families. But to Oliver, they were a confession signed in blood. Family takes care of family. Blake, Oliver replied, staring at the rain streaking down the glass. The first thread of the noose had just been tied, and Blake had happily handed him the rope. The Velvet Room was Boston's premier sanctuary for old money and new sins. Hidden behind an unmarked door in Back Bay, the private club smelled of aged cedar, expensive bourbon, and the quiet arrogance of people who believed they owned the city. The lighting was intentionally dim, designed to obscure the faces of politicians and CEOs as they conducted business in the velvet-lined alcoves. Oliver stood near the brass rail of the mahogany bar, a glass of neat Macallan sweating in his grip. Across the crowded room, illuminated by the soft glow of a tiered crystal chandelier, stood Vivian and Blake. To the casual observer, they were merely a striking woman in an emerald evening gown, conversing with her husband's closest friend. But Oliver was no longer a casual observer. He was a forensic investigator analyzing an active crime scene. Now that he possessed the cipher, he could read the invisible, sickening language they spoke. He watched the way Blake leaned in just a fraction of an inch too close to hear her over the low hum of the jazz quartet. He noted how Vivian's laughter lasted a second too long, her gaze dropping to Blake's mouth before fluttering back to his eyes. It was a flawlessly choreographed dance of adultery practiced and perfected over 6 years of stolen moments. The way you look at me across a crowded room, knowing no one else can see the fire she had written in one of the letters dated from a winter gala 2 years ago. Oliver took a slow sip of his scotch. The burn in his throat was nothing compared to the glacial fury solidifying in his chest. He set the glass down and began to weave his way through the sea of tailored tuxedos and silk dresses. As he approached, he smoothly slid his arm around Vivian's waist, pulling her flush against his side. He felt it instantly, the microscopic stiffening of her spine, the subtle, guilty hitch in her breathing. She recovered beautifully, leaning her head against his shoulder with a radiant, painted smile. "Darling," Vivian murmured, her gardenia perfume mixing with the scent of Blake's expensive cologne. "Blake was just telling me about the incredible projections for the new tech merger. You two are going to take over the world. We do make a formidable team." Oliver agreed, his voice a smooth velvet purr. He looked directly at Blake, noting the faint, almost imperceptible tension in the other man's jaw when Oliver's hand rested possessively on Vivian's hip. "Speaking of the merger, Blake, I spoke with Tom Harrison this afternoon regarding your private buy-in for the mezzanine fund." Blake's expression shifted to business, the charming mask snapping back into place. "And are we cleared for the $2 million? The compliance committee is hesitant." Oliver lied flawlessly, his eyes reflecting the dim chandelier light. "They feel leveraging that much of your primary trust is too concentrated a risk for a single partner bidding with my endorsement. They want a secondary guarantor. Or you need to collateralize the offshore holdings you manage." Blake hesitated. The offshore accounts were his absolute safety net, his untouchable liquid assets. Tying them to a high-risk tech acquisition was a massive, unprecedented gamble. "It is entirely your call, of course." Oliver continued, his tone casual, almost dismissive. "I can tell Tom to scale back your involvement to a standard tier. You would still make a respectable return. It's the safer play." Oliver knew exactly how to play Blake Storm. Blake's entire ego was built on being the smartest, most aggressive predator in the room. He despised being told to play it safe, especially in front of the woman he was secretly trying to impress. Vivian looked at Blake, her hazel eyes wide with silent encouragement, proud of the empire her husband and her lover were building together. The agonizing irony of it nearly made Oliver smile. "No," Blake said, his voice hardening with resolve. "Don't scale it back. Draft the paperwork for the offshore collateral. I want the maximum yield. I trust your models, Oliver. We are going an all-in." "Excellent," Oliver said softly. He raised his half-empty glass of scotch, tapping it gently against Blake's champagne flute. A sharp crystal clink rang out over the melancholy jazz music. "To going all in, and to the things we hold most dear." He drank the rest of his whiskey, feeling the satisfying icy click of the trap's steel jaws locking perfectly into place. The glow of the multiple monitors in Oliver's corner office bathed his face in a cold blue light. It was past midnight, and the 42nd floor of Sinclair Ventures was a tomb of absolute silence. He sat alone, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with lethal precision. He was not analyzing data. He was building a labyrinth with no exit. Through a series of encrypted shell companies he had established years ago for high-risk offshore ventures, Oliver began moving the collateral Blake had so arrogantly signed over. The tech merger they had discussed was real, but its foundation was built on sand. Oliver had access to the target company's unredacted debt liabilities information he had deliberately omitted from the board's prospectus. He tethered Blake's entire liquid fortune, including his untouchable offshore safety nets, directly to the most toxic assets of the acquisition. With one final keystroke, Oliver programmed the automated margin calls. They would activate the moment the tech company's quarterly earnings missed their projections at the end of the week. It was an invisible financial guillotine suspended by a single thread of digital code. He leaned back in his leather chair watching the transaction confirm. The destruction was now autonomous. 3 days later, the air inside the Oakwood estate grew heavy with an unspoken, suffocating tension. Oliver sat on the edge of their king-size bed, slowly unbuttoning his cuffs. Across the room, Vivian stood at her vanity mirror, aggressively brushing her hair. Her movements were unusually rigid, her flawless composure beginning to fracture at the edges. Her phone lay face down on the marble surface. It had vibrated twice in the last 10 minutes, and both times she had visibly flinched. Oliver knew exactly why. The markets had closed 2 hours ago. The tech company had announced a catastrophic loss, missing projections by a staggering 30%. Blake's portfolio was currently in a violent freefall, the margin algorithms ruthlessly ripping his offshore accounts to shreds to cover the fabricated debts. "You seem distracted tonight, Vivian," Oliver said, his voice a soothing low murmur. He walked over gently, taking the silver-plated brush from her trembling hand. He began to run the bristles through her dark hair, mimicking the motions of a devoted, attentive husband. She closed her eyes, releasing a shaky breath. "It is just a headache. The shifting weather has been giving me migraines all week." "Are you sure?" Oliver asked, meeting her gaze in the reflection of the mirror. His eyes were pools of dark manufactured sympathy. "You have been checking your phone constantly since dinner. Is something wrong with Maya's school, or perhaps something else?" Vivian swallowed hard, her throat working against a rising tide of panic. She could not tell him that Blake had not answered her desperate text for 2 days. She could not tell him that the man she had loved in the shadows was suddenly inexplicably unreachable. "Everything is perfectly fine," she lied, her voice paper thin. "Just some tedious emails from the charity committee demanding immediate answers." Oliver placed his hands on her bare shoulders, his thumbs pressing into the tight knotted muscles at the base of her neck. He felt her shudder under his touch. It was deeply intoxicating, the raw power of knowing exactly what was destroying her from the inside out, while she desperately tried to hide the bleeding. "You carry too much weight on those shoulders," Oliver whispered, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the crown of her head. "If you ever need to talk about anything at all, you know I am always here to listen. We do not keep secrets in this house." In the mirror, he watched her hazel eyes widen in a microscopic flash of sheer terror before the porcelain mask slammed back into place. The phantom margin call had not just drained Blake's bank accounts. It had begun to bankrupt Vivian's sanity. The sleek leather of Oliver's overnight bag snapped shut with a definitive click. It was Thursday morning, and the master bedroom was flooded with pale, overcast Boston light. Vivian stood by the doorway, her arms crossed elegantly over her cashmere sweater. She had prepared his usual travel espresso, playing the role of the devoted executive wife with nauseating perfection. "I hate that you have to fly to Chicago on such short notice," she murmured, stepping forward as to adjust the lapels of his charcoal suit. "Especially with Maya's birthday this weekend. You promise you will be back by Saturday morning." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Oliver replied, his voice a masterclass in warm reassurance. He leaned down, pressing a lingering kiss to her cheek. He tasted the faint salt of nervous perspiration beneath her expensive moisturizer. "The restructuring at the Midwest branch requires my physical signature. It should only take 48 hours. Keep the house safe while I am gone." "Always," she whispered, offering a flawlessly crafted smile. Oliver picked up his bag and walked out the front door, slipping into the waiting black car. He told the driver to head toward Logan International Airport, but Oliver Hartwell was not going to Chicago. 30 minutes later, the town car dropped him off at a discreet luxury rental agency near the harbor. He exchanged his usual presents for a nondescript dark gray sedan with heavily tinted windows. He drove back toward the suburbs, his phone entirely switched off. For the next 3 days, as far as the world was concerned, Oliver Hartwell was in the air or locked in boardrooms. He was a ghost. By nightfall, the street lamps of Oakwood Estates flickered to life, casting long skeletal shadows across the manicured lawns. Oliver parked the gray sedan 3 houses down from his own property, perfectly concealed beneath the heavy weeping branches of an ancient willow tree. The rain had returned, a persistent icy drizzle that blurred the windshield. He sat in the suffocating silence of the dark car, a thermos of black coffee untouched in the cup holder. He watched the warm golden light spilling from the windows of his own home. At 8 o'clock, the lights in Maya's bedroom went dark. Vivian had put their daughter to sleep. The house was now empty of innocence. At exactly 9:15, a pair of headlights swept down the quiet, affluent street. The vehicle did not slow down to check addresses. It moved with the confident familiarity of a frequent visitor. The black Range Rover pulled smoothly into the Hartwell driveway, cutting its engine immediately. Oliver's grip on the leather steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned entirely white. He recognized the license plate. He recognized the man who stepped out into the rain, pulling the collar of his trench coat up against the wind. It was Blake. Despite the ongoing financial bloodbath Oliver had secretly unleashed upon him, Blake had come. The arrogance of it was staggering. Oliver watched as the front door of his home opened before Blake even had to knock. The porch light illuminated Vivian's silhouette. She was wearing the white silk robe. She pulled Blake into it by the lapels of his coat, and the heavy oak door slammed shut, plunging the porch back into darkness. A violent, primitive roar clawed at the back of Oliver's throat, begging to be released. The letters had been a theoretical agony ink on paper, but this was a physical violation of his sanctuary. He closed his eyes, his breathing shallow and jagged. He could picture them walking up the oak staircase. He could picture them in his bed. The urge to kick the door down and destroy them both with his bare hands was agonizingly potent. But Oliver forced his eyes open, staring at the rain-slicked windshield. Patience, he told himself, the word a freezing mantra in his mind. Let them have tonight. By next week, they will have absolutely nothing. Monday morning arrived with the sterile, unforgiving hum of the Sinclair Ventures ventilation system. Oliver sat behind his massive mahogany desk, reviewing the weekend market reports. He had returned from Chicago late Sunday night, greeting Vivian with a tired smile and a rehearsed story about Midwest distribution logistics. She had kissed him, her lips cold, her eyes shadowed with a frantic, concealed exhaustion. The poison was working perfectly. The heavy glass door to Oliver's office swung open violently, shattering the quiet. Blake stormed in, entirely bypassing the receptionist. For the first time in 10 years, Blake looked truly ragged. The effortless, magnetic charisma was completely gone, replaced by the erratic energy of a cornered animal. His bespoke suit was wrinkled, his silk tie loosened carelessly, and dark, bruised bags hung beneath his bloodshot eyes. He closed the door behind him and locked it, leaning heavily against the glass. Oliver did not blink. He slowly capped his Mont Blanc pen and set it precisely parallel to his leather portfolio. Good morning, Blake. You missed the 9 o'clock executive briefing. The offshore accounts are gone. Oliver. Blake rasped, his voice a hoarse, desperate whisper. He pushed off the door and practically lunged toward the desk, slamming a thick manila folder onto the polished wood. The tech acquisition tanked on Friday afternoon. The algorithms triggered a cascade margin call over the weekend. They liquidated my secondary trusts. They froze the Cayman assets. I am bleeding out. Oliver opened the folder, feigning a slow, methodical examination of the devastation he had personally engineered in the dark. The numbers were catastrophic. Blake was not just broke, he was millions of dollars in debt to brutal institutional lenders. This is severe, Oliver murmured, his tone laced with a perfectly calibrated measure of grave concern. The leverage was highly concentrated. I warned you about the secondary guarantor, Blake. I know what you warned me about, Blake snapped, running a trembling hand through his hair. He caught himself forcing a deep breath, trying to summon the persuasive charm that had always been his greatest weapon. Oh, listen to me. I need a bridge loan from the firm's reserve capital. $5 million. Just enough to unfreeze the Cayman accounts and halt the liquidation. I will pay it back with interest the moment the tech stock rebounds. You know it will rebound. Oliver looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Blake's desperate gaze. He thought of the black Range Rover sitting in his rain-slicked driveway. He thought of the white silk robe and the bedroom door closing in the dark. A bridge loan of $5 million requires a unanimous vote from the Risk Management Committee, Oliver stated evenly, leaning back in his chair. And it requires my signature as the senior underwriter. You are asking me to use the firm's protected capital to cover a personal, high-risk margin deficit. A deficit built on offshore accounts that the board explicitly told you not to collateralize. I am asking my partner to throw me a rope, Blake slammed his palms onto the desk, his voice cracking. We built this place together, Oliver. I stood beside you at your wedding. I am family. You sign the authorization, and the committee won't blink. They follow your lead. Please. The silence that followed was heavy, toxic, and absolute. Oliver let Blake marinate in it. He let the silence stretch until the ambient hum of the building seemed deafening. He studied the beads of cold sweat forming on Blake's forehead, savoring the absolute terror in the other man's eyes. I cannot authorize this, Blake, Oliver said softly, the words dropping like heavy stones into a bottomless well. Blake froze. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him a pale, hollowed-out shell. What? As a friend, I am deeply sorry for your position. Oliver continued, his voice devoid of any human warmth, a machine executing a flawless protocol. But as the senior partner of Sinclair Ventures, my fiduciary duty is to the firm and its investors. Your portfolio is currently a localized contagion. If I inject firm capital into your failing accounts, the contagion spreads to us. I will not let you sink this ship to save yourself. You are cutting me off, Blake whispered, sheer disbelief fracturing his voice. Oliver, if you do not sign this, I lose everything. My properties, the trust, my equity in this firm. Then I suggest you call your personal lawyers and prepare for insolvency. Oliver replied, closing the manila folder and sliding it back across the desk. There is no rope, Blake. You jumped entirely on your own. By Wednesday evening, the pristine atmosphere of the Oakwood estate had curdled into something suffocating. Vivian sat in the formal living room, an unread novel resting on her lap. She had visibly lost weight in just a matter of days. The flawless, aristocratic poise she had weaponized for years was beginning to splinter. Blake had barely spoken to her since Monday. When he did answer his burner phone, his voice was a frantic, unrecognizable sneer of a man drowning in debt. He had demanded she ask Oliver for money, a grotesque, impossible request that made her stomach turn. Oliver entered the room carrying 2 crystal glasses of bourbon. He moved with a relaxed, predatory grace. The psychological dismantling of his wife was his new favorite game, a slow-drip torture that required no raised voices and no broken glass. He set her drink on the coaster beside her, taking the opposite armchair. You look pale, darling. Oliver noted, his voice draped in velvet concern. He reached into his tailored suit pocket and produced a sleek silver cigar tube, setting it carefully on the mahogany coffee table between them. I stopped by the tobacconist downtown today. Picked up a few Cohiba Siglo 60s. Vivian's eyes flicked to the silver tube and the color drained rapidly from her cheeks. It was Blake's exact brand. The scent of those specific cigars clung to the leather interior of his Range Rover. It was the scent she spent 20 minutes washing out of her hair after their hotel afternoons. I thought you gave up smoking, she managed to say, her throat tightening around the words. She picked up her bourbon, desperate to hide the slight tremor in her fingers. I did, Oliver smiled, gently swirling the amber liquid in his glass. But Blake smokes them, doesn't he? I thought I might keep a few around the house, just in case he drops by. He has been under a tremendous amount of stress lately. I want him to feel completely at home here. The subtext was a razor blade hidden inside a silk handkerchief. Vivian took a sharp sip of the bourbon, the alcohol burning its way down her throat. That is very thoughtful of you, Oliver. Is his financial situation truly that dire? It is a total collapse. Oliver sighed, feigning a look of profound melancholy. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, closing the physical distance between them. His dark eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. It makes you realize how fragile everything is. One reckless decision, one hidden mistake, and an entire life's work simply burns to ash. You think you know a man, you trust him with your most valuable assets, and then you discover he has been keeping a secondary ledger the entire time. Vivian's breath hitched. She forced herself to maintain eye contact, her manicured nails digging into the leather binding of the book on her lap. He is talking about the market, her rational mind screamed. He only means the offshore accounts. But the suffocating weight in his stare felt intensely, violently personal. I suppose we never truly know anyone, she whispered the lie, tasting like bile. Perhaps, Oliver conceded softly. He stood up, walking slowly behind her chair. He placed his hands lightly on her bare shoulders. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear. The proximity made her entire body go rigid, her pulse roaring in her ears. "I worry about you when I travel to Chicago," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. "The house is so quiet when I am gone. I always wonder, does the echo of my absence ever get too loud, Vivian?" The exact words from her letter. Vivian gasped quietly, a sharp, involuntary intake of air. Her heart began to hammer violently against her ribs. She looked up at him in the reflection of the dark window pane, searching for malice, searching for the accusation. But Oliver merely smiled, the perfect, loving husband, kissing his wife's temple before walking toward the study. He left the silver cigar tube on the table, a ticking bomb resting in the center of her crumbling world. The dining room of the Oakwood estate was bathed in the warm golden light of the crystal chandelier, a stark contrast to the freezing Boston rain lashing against the window panes. It was Friday night. The mahogany table was set with the finest DuPont family silver and bone china. It looked like a celebration. It was, in fact, an execution. Oliver sat at the head of the table, cutting his medium rare steak with surgical precision. To his right sat Vivian, adorned in a backless black evening gown, her posture rigidly perfect, despite the dark circles meticulously concealed beneath her makeup. To his left sat Blake Storm. Blake looked entirely broken. The aggressive, charismatic venture capitalist had been hollowed out by 5 days of relentless financial hemorrhage. He had come to the dinner as a final desperate plea for salvation, hoping the intimacy of a shared meal would soften Oliver's resolve. "The filet is exceptional, Vivian," Blake managed to say, his voice lacking its usual resonance. He took a heavy swallow of his red wine, his hands visibly shaking. "Thank you for hosting. I know it has been a difficult week at the firm." "Oliver insisted," Vivian replied, her voice tight. She kept her eyes fixed on her plate. Ever since the incident with the cigar tube, she had existed in a state of suffocating paranoia, jumping at every shadow in her own home. Oliver dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin, his expression one of profound, serene contentment. He picked up the bottle of vintage Bordeaux, a rare 1996 Chateau Margaux, and leaned over to refill Blake's glass, then Vivian's. "It is important to gather the people who matter most when the storm hits," Oliver said smoothly, the double entendre landing flawlessly. "To remember what is truly valuable. Wealth is fleeting, Blake, but trust, loyalty, those are the foundations of an empire." Blake swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat trailing down his temple. "Exactly, which is why I was hoping we could discuss the bridge loan again. The offshore accounts. Let us not ruin a beautiful dinner with the ugly realities of the market." Oliver interrupted, his tone gentle but absolute. He raised his wine glass, holding it up toward the chandelier. The red liquid caught the light, gleaming like liquid ruby. "I would rather propose a toast." Vivian reluctantly raised her glass, her hazel eyes meeting Oliver's. The terrifying emptiness she saw there made her breath hitch. "To my beautiful wife and to my closest friend." Oliver began, his voice a low, mesmerizing hum that commanded the silent room. "We have built such a magnificent life together, haven't we? It is almost poetic." He took a slow sip of the wine. Blake forced a weak smile, raising his glass higher. "I was reading an old poem the other day." Oliver continued, setting his glass down and resting his elbows on the table. He looked directly at Vivian, pinning her to her chair with his gaze. "It spoke of hidden fires, the way you look at me across a crowded room knowing no one else can see the fire." The silver fork slipped from Vivian's hand, clattering loudly against the bone china. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. All the blood instantly vanished from her face, leaving her a ghastly, translucent white. Blake frowned, confused by her sudden terror. "Are you all right, Viv?" Oliver ignored him, his dark eyes never leaving his wife. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a terrifying, intimate whisper. "The house is so quiet when he is gone, but it only makes the echo of you louder. I sat by the window in the study tonight wearing the silk robe you left at the hotel, imagining your hands." Blake froze. The wine glass in his hand stopped halfway to his mouth. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He slowly turned his head to look at Oliver, sheer, unadulterated horror spanning in his chest. "A beautiful sentiment, don't you think?" Oliver asked the paralyzed room, a chilling, hollow smile curving his lips. "Almost as beautiful as the mahogany box hidden behind the workbench in the garage." Vivian stopped breathing. The invisible guillotine had finally dropped. The silence that followed Oliver's words was absolute, broken only by the relentless lashing of the rain against the dining room windows. The air in the room grew instantly stagnant, thick with the metallic scent of adrenaline and sudden inescapable terror. Blake stared across the mahogany table, his bloodshot eyes wide. The pieces of the past 5 days suddenly snapped together with violent, sickening clarity. The delayed authorizations, the targeted margin calls, the frozen offshore accounts. The tech acquisition, Blake whispered, his voice trembling. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. The algorithms. It wasn't the market. It was you. You liquidated me. Oliver did not blink. He picked up his crystal glass and took a slow, measured sip of the Bordeaux. I am a venture capitalist, Blake. I identify liabilities and I eradicate them. You were a catastrophic liability operating within my own home. Beside him, Vivian stood up. The movement was jerky, uncoordinated, a stark departure from her usual aristocratic grace. Her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. She looked entirely translucent, a ghost trapped in a black evening gown. But as Oliver looked up at her, waiting for the predictable tears and the desperate apologies, he saw something else entirely. He saw the cornered, feral desperation of a woman whose survival was deeply threatened. You do not understand, Oliver. She breathed, her chest heaving. Oliver let out a dry, humorless sound that barely resembled a laugh. I understand perfectly, Vivian. I understand that my wife and my business partner have been acting out a cheap, predictable romance in boutique hotels for 6 years. 8, Vivian corrected him, her voice cracking. The single word hung in the air, suspended like the blade of a guillotine. Oliver froze. The glacial calm he had maintained for a week finally fractured. He slowly set his wine glass down. 8. They had been married for 8 years. Blake looked away, his jaw tight, staring intently at the floorboards in profound shame. We were together before. Vivian confessed, the tears finally spilling over her lashes, tracing dark lines through her immaculate makeup. In Cambridge, long before Sinclair Ventures existed. Long before you built the models that made Blake rich. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Oliver felt a cold, phantom hand grip his lungs. He stared at the woman he had sworn to protect, suddenly realizing he was looking at a complete stranger. The DuPont estate was drowning. She continued, her words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. My father was facing a federal indictment for hidden debts. We were going to lose everything, the house, the name, the legacy. Blake had the vision, but he had no capital. He was just a struggling salesman. You were the prodigy, Oliver. You were the architect who could generate limitless wealth. Oliver processed the words, feeling the last vestiges of his humanity harden into diamond. It had not been a marriage that decayed into an affair. It had been a hostile corporate takeover from the very beginning. They had sacrificed their public relationship so Vivian could secure the DuPont legacy with Oliver's money while using his genius to build Blake's empire, all while they continued their romance in the shadows. I had to marry the anchor, she sobbed, reaching a trembling hand toward him across the table. My family made it clear, but I learned to care for you, Oliver. I truly did. Oliver looked at her outstretched hand as if it were a venomous serpent. He stood up slowly, meticulously buttoning his suit jacket. The grief was gone. The anger was gone. What remained was a terrifying absolute void. So I was never a husband, Oliver said, his voice dropping to a dead, inflectionless whisper. I was a bank, a beautifully tailored ATM. Oliver, please. Blake started rising from his chair. Sit down, Oliver commanded, the sheer icy authority in his voice, forcing Blake back into his seat. Oliver looked between the two of them, the architects of his fabricated life. The letters in the garage were an insult to my pride, but this is an insult to my intelligence. You built a glass house with my money, Oliver said, his voice completely devoid of the rage they were both anticipating. He buttoned his suit jacket, stepping away from the mahogany table. And you thought I would never check the foundation. He did not wait for Vivian's tears or Blake's desperate negotiations. He simply turned his back on the wreckage of his dining room and walked out the front door. He stepped into the freezing Boston rain, leaving the Oakwood estate behind. He would never sleep under that roof again. At 8 a.m. on Monday, the executive boardroom of Sinclair Ventures was packed. The emergency meeting had been called by Oliver himself. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and impending doom as the board members reviewed the thick black dossiers Oliver had placed at every seat. Blake Storm was not present. His security badge had been deactivated at the lobby turnstiles 20 minutes earlier. "What you are looking at," Oliver addressed the room standing at the head of the table with his hands clasped behind his back, "is a comprehensive record of severe fiduciary negligence and unauthorized leverage committed by my co-founder, Blake Storm. He tied his offshore accounts to toxic assets, bypassing our compliance protocols." Murmurs of shock rippled through the room, but Oliver was not finished. He reached into his briefcase and produced a single cream-colored envelope, dropping it onto the center of the glass table. "Furthermore," Oliver continued, his voice echoing like a tolling bell, "Blake has been engaged in a long-term clandestine affair with my wife, an affair that predates the founding of this firm. The financial recklessness you see in those folders was not just greed. It was the desperation of a man trying to sustain a double life and protect a fraudulent marriage tied to the DuPont estate." The silence in the boardroom was absolute paralyzing horror. Oliver had not just fired his partner. He had exposed him to the SEC, the board, and the merciless judgment of their peers. But Oliver knew the price of this execution. The chairman of the board, an aging titan of Boston finance, looked at Oliver with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. "You knew about the tech merger's volatility, Oliver," the chairman said quietly. "You let him take that position. You weaponized the firm's assets to settle a domestic dispute. You have tanked our quarterly stock to ruin one man." "I excised a cancer," Oliver replied evenly. "The method was necessary." "The method was reckless," the chairman countered, his voice hardening. "We will be dealing with federal audits for years. We accept Blake's termination. But we are also demanding your immediate resignation effective today. You are a liability, Oliver. You let your personal vendetta blind your professional duty." Oliver did not argue. He simply withdrew his silver Montblanc pen, signed the resignation letter he had already drafted, and pushed it across the table. By noon, the shockwave hit the Back Bay. Through anonymous, untraceable emails, the love letters from the garage were leaked to the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association, the St. Catherine's Preparatory Board, and every elite charity committee Vivian chaired. The prestigious DuPont name, the very legacy she had sacrificed her entire life and Oliver's soul to protect, was instantly reduced to a cheap, scandalous punchline in every country club in Massachusetts. She was stripped of her titles, her social standing evaporating into thin air. Oliver stood by the window of his corner office, watching the gray rain wash over the city as he packed a single cardboard box. He had successfully burned their world to the ground. Blake was facing federal bankruptcy and public disgrace. Vivian was an outcast trapped in the ruins of her aristocratic lie. But as Oliver looked at his reflection in the cold glass, he realized he was staring at a man who had nothing left. He had wealth, but he had no firm, no family, and no purpose. The fire had consumed them all. The final act of the dismantling took place in the lobby of the Oakwood estate 2 weeks later. The grand house, once a monument to Oliver's success and Vivian's social standing, was being emptied. The air smelled of cardboard dust and the cold clinical reality of a court-ordered liquidation. Oliver stood by the grand staircase, his hands buried in the pockets of a long-wool overcoat. He watched as two movers carried out the mahogany dining table, the same table where he had served the final toxic meal. Vivian emerged from the kitchen, dressed in a simple trench coat. Her signature jewelry was gone, sold to pay the retainer for the divorce attorneys who were currently fighting over the scraps of a bankrupt estate. She looked older, her face stripped of the expensive radiance that had been her primary weapon. She stopped 10 feet away from him, the distance between them now an unbridgeable chasm. "Are you satisfied, Oliver?" she asked. Her voice was flat, the fire and the desperation having finally burned out. "Blake is living in a studio apartment in Southie, facing a 5-year ban from the securities industry. My father has had a stroke from the shame. I have lost everything." "You lost nothing that was actually yours," Oliver replied, his tone devoid of triumph. "It was merely a statement of fact. You traded a man's life for a name you couldn't afford. You were living on credit, Vivian, in every sense of the word. I simply called in the debt." "And what do you have?" she countered, a ghost of her former defiance flickering in her eyes. "You destroyed Sinclair Ventures. You are a pariah in the valley. You sit alone in a hotel room, counting money that no longer has a purpose. You didn't just kill us. You killed the version of yourself that was capable of loving anything. Oliver looked at her, and for a fleeting second, he felt a sharp, crystalline pang of grief. Not for her, but for the man who had believed in the letters. He thought of the garage, the smell of oil, and the beautiful handwritten lies that had been his only oxygen. The version of me that loved you was a fiction, Oliver said. He was a character in a play you and Blake wrote. I am simply the man who ended the performance. He turned away from her, walking toward the front door. Outside, the black car was waiting. He had already signed the papers for a long-term lease on a villa in a remote corner of the Swiss Alps, a place where no one knew the name DuPont and no one cared about the fall of a Boston venture capitalist. As he reached the driveway, he saw a black sedan idling at the gate. The window rolled down to reveal Blake. He looked gaunt, his skin gray against the cheap fabric of a mass-produced suit. He didn't speak. He didn't scream. He simply stared at Oliver with a look of profound, paralyzed hatred. Oliver met his gaze for a long, unflinching moment. He realized then that they were linked forever, bound together by the wreckage of their shared deception. He had won the war, but he had lost the world. He climbed into the back of his car. To the airport, he told the driver. As the car pulled away, Oliver looked back at the Oakwood estate one last time. The movers were carrying out the mahogany box from the garage. They didn't know it was empty. They didn't know the ashes of the letters had already been scattered into the Atlantic. He leaned back and closed his eyes. The silence was finally absolute. It wasn't the peace he had imagined, but it was the only thing he had left that was true.